Hello, I'm Larry Blank, and this is From the Pit number 11. I thought today I would go a little bit further with my career and talk a little bit about orchestrating and composing for film and TV in Hollywood. Uh, when last we spoke, I was conducting Phantom of the Opera in LA, and I was studying with Erwin Kostel, orchestration and composition, and I was pushing very hard to try to find some work doing film and TV. My good friend uh, Marilee Bradford, who was working at MGM, recommended me to Mark Shaman, and therefore Mark hired me to be one of the three orchestrators on That's Entertainment 3, which was right up my alley. It was MGM movies. It was recognizing the orchestrations of Conrad Salinger, who did all the great MGM musicals with other guys. And it was really just the right thing for me. And it was a very thankful recommendation from Marilee and beginning of my relationship with Mark Shaman. So Mark hired me, and along with Hummy Man and Jeff Itmagi, and I was one of the orchestrators on That's Entertainment 3. It was conducted by John Mauceri, whom I knew, and it was with the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra, so it was a fantastic orchestra, uh, fantastic project, great fun to do, and as I said, right up my alley. So I had to recreate some Salinger arrangements, and fortunately, there was lots to listen to, big orchestra, and good fun for all of us. Uh, I don't think there were any major issues on it. It went very well and was very good to get me included that way. In the meantime, I was wanting to write episodic TV. There was a lot of TV production going on during the 80s and 90s. This was roughly 1989 going into the 90s. And there was still tons of episodic TV. And I made friends through Irv Kostel with Peter Myers, who was very helpful to me. And from Joe Soldo, the orchestra contractor, I was introduced to Mort Stevens. Mort was a fantastic talent who sadly died prematurely, but he was mostly known for writing the music for Hawaii Five-O and Police Story, the themes. So he was very well thought of, and he was very close with Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams. And had he not been the head of music at CBS, he probably would have done a lot more film scores, although he did do several and much TV. And he was very helpful to me. So I managed through my friend Richard Kaufman, who was the head of music at MGM, to get hired to score an episode of In the Heat of the Night, which was a weekly TV series with Carol O'Connor, and very successful at that. And strange choice to hire me. The other composers on the show were Nan Schwartz and David Bell, who were very busy doing episodes, and neither was too thrilled to have another composer coming on board because it meant less work for them if I were given some episodes. But nevertheless, I was given an opportunity. And it's a strange show because the music had to sound like it was down deep South Georgia. There was a lot of electronics on it, plus a big orchestra with strings. And they had in the orchestra a guitar player who uh, played and scatted along, which really helped to, make you think you were in the deep South. His name was Mac Doherty. He was wonderful and really helped to make things sail along. The first opportunity I had was to write an audition cue for music for one of the episodes. And what it was this woman in high heels being chased around the square in the center of Atlanta by two police. Her chances of being caught were 100%. She couldn't move very fast in her high heel shoes, and it was pretty funny to see these two guys chasing her around in slow motion, the center of Atlanta. But of course, it was a minute and a half to 2 minutes of them trying to catch her, which obviously was going to happen. But you had to make some music to make it happen. So on Heat of the Night, they also had an iwi, which was an electric woodwind, a synth woodwind that was played. and you could get all sorts of sounds out of it. And I was basically using a saxophone sound with Mac Doherty on the guitar, uh, playing some rhythm licks and scatting along, plus the strings. So I had this brilliant idea, at least brilliant to me, of using pizzicato strings, which would blow their minds because why would they have pizzicato strings playing in an episode of In the Heat of the Night? Pizzicato, of course, is plucking the strings, and it's really for symphonic use and that sort of thing. So in this setting of In the Heat of the Night, where they usually had Mac singing with string pads, it was unusual. So I had this 2 minute chase going on where nothing was really happening except my music with the drums going along. It was very exciting, and the saxophone solo and Mac doing his thing. And the producer on the show turned to me. I was in the booth. Richard Kaufman was conducting when he heard the pizzicato strings, and he said, "What are those bumps in the orchestra?" I quickly thought out loud to myself. I said, "Bumps? Oh," I said, "they're history." And I immediately got rid of them because I realized explaining to the line producer on a show of Heat of the Night that what pizzicato strings were was not going to do me well. So anyway, that was my first foray into writing music, but they liked the music, so they gave me an episode. The line producer thought, because I was a theatrical guy, he'd give me a different kind of episode. So he did. He gave me one which was about two sisters, and one of them was slightly, let's say, mentally not acute, and she had been raped and had a child, and very complicated little story. But the beginning of the episode was Bubba, one of the policemen, on his weekend holiday in the hills by a lake with his dog Blue, fishing, taking some time off. So the episode was very different in that it began with this very bucolic setting of Bubba fishing, as opposed to being in the middle of Atlanta doing a chase with a woman in high heel shoes. So I wrote this very, very Aaron Copland type of music, with a southern feel, I hope. Very wide open chords with the strings, which sounded quite nice, with Mac Doherty on the guitar playing some figures and scatting along to make it sound more like Aaron Copland goes to, you know, down south in Georgia rather than Aaron Copland. Uh, and I thought it was kind of effective, but the problem was in the middle of the scene, the dog finds something, and it's something bad, and he gets Bubba, his master, and brings him into the woods and brings him to see this horrible thing that he sees. But the audience doesn't get to see what it is. The last thing you see is Bubba looking down at this thing and going like that, shock, and then it cuts to commercials. So, not having a clue as to what to write for this other than the bucolic music at the beginning, I didn't know how to get this music to cut to commercials. So I called up Mort Stevens because he was such an expert at this. And I showed him the video on it, and he said, "Well, this is easy. You have to write an oy vey chord." And I said, "Okay, what's an oy vey chord?" And he said, "Well, the audience doesn't see what's going on, so you have to write something that's upsetting." So I said, "I don't know how to do this." He says, "Of course you don't." So he said, "Write something very pretty," which I did with this bucolic music. And then when Bubba gets closer, you have to write the music so it's more nervous. He said, "So keep a pretty melody and have someone going boom, 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 boom in the background." Well, this is television writing. It's not Broadway, so you can't have the drums coming in going boom, boom. It's very distracting. So I had some lower strings, bumping along, and then all of a sudden, when he sees, this terrible thing, which in fact was a discarded fetus from the sister who didn't do so well. But the audience doesn't know that until later. So right now, all you're seeing is Bubba's face. So he said, write a big, beautiful C chord and then have the cello wind down on a C scale, and then right at the bottom, hit a wrong note, which, oy vey. It's an oive chord. You play a C chord and then put an A flat on the bottom, oive. And you cut to commercial and everybody's happy. Well, we had a good laugh. And of course, when I did this in the studio, it was extremely successful. And I was composer for the day. And my episode was a big hit. Didn't lead to a lot more episodes, but it was successful. So I learned how to write an oive chord from Mort Stephens. In the meantime, uh, I got a phone call from Marvin Hamlish, who asked if I could persuade Erwin Kostel to come out of retirement to write something for the Academy Awards for Marvin Hamlish. And I called up Irvin and said, Marvin says he can't do this without you. And apparently it turned out to be the rather infamous episode of the Academy Awards where Lorna Luft came out singing as Snow White. Alan Carr was the producer, and it was quite a disaster in the history of the Academy Awards. Irv did a beautiful job, but the whole concept was kind of poor. And Irv said to me, please don't ask me again to do you any favors for your friends, even if it's Marvin Hamlish. But Irv did tell Marvin that he would only do it if Marvin would give me the opportunity to write some music for the Academy Awards, which was a big deal because it was not a high paying job, but it was an honor to write for the Academy Awards. Just play ons and playoffs. Now, play ons, or when they say, and now Paul Newman accepts his award for whatever it was, and the orchestra plays some piece of music. Those are play-ons. And they're just a few seconds of music, but they do have to be written and orchestrated for the, huge orchestra at the Academy Awards, which was upwards of 50. So I was glad to get this opportunity. So Irv persuades Marvin to give me the shot, and Marvin says to me, I want you to write a play-on for Olivia Newton-John. Now, generally, a play-on is 16 bars of music, and by the time the artist walks out on stage, you play 8, maybe 10, 12 bars, but you have to write at least 16 bars. Well, Marvin says to me, I don't want this usual Academy Award stuff of 16 bars. I want you to write 32 bars, and we'll play it. And you really have to write this well. Don't write the trumpets playing the melody. Write it, so it's gorgeous with strings. And Irv said to me, don't pay any attention to him. Just write 16 bars. And I said, I can't do that. So I had to do what Marvin asked me to do. And I wrote what was my greatest masterpiece up to that point in my career. I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever written. They played it at the orchestra rehearsal. Indeed, it was as it was like listening to Mahler. I had that orchestra playing everything that they could play. So I was proclaimed a genius for the moment. At the Academy Awards, they go, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, by the way, the song was A Pretty Girl's Like a Melody. So 16 bars of genius on Irving Berlin's Pretty Girls Like a Melody. Ladies and gentlemen, Olivia Newton-John. The orchestra goes da, 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 and Marvin cuts the orchestra off because Olivia Newton-John is in place. So my career was dashed right away when they only played the first 3 notes of my masterpiece, but I had a good laugh about it. After that, I started getting quite a few calls from Mark Shaman to work on films. He would usually give me the cues that were musical theater type cues, production numbers, or something that had a big band feel. And he had Jeff and Brad Decter and Mark McKenzie doing the more legitimate cues, and also another wonderful orchestrator named Frank Bennett. So on this one picture called North, which Rob Reiner directed, they asked for a cue, what's called a source cue. A source cue is music that isn't really underscoring a scene, but if you're in a bar and the jukebox is playing One for My Baby, that's a source cue. Somebody has to write the music for the orchestra to play. Well, the source cue I was asked to write was The Girl from Ipanema, and it took place in a massage parlor. And John Lovitz was in it, and he's getting a massage of a sexual nature. And through the radio, you're hearing Girl from Ipanema, and it's kind of funny, a funny scene. So I had to write a full chorus of The Girl from Ipanema with the bridge, and I had a 80-piece orchestra, and it was all coming through this little speaker in a massage parlor. Once again, I got my forces together and I wrote a Mancini-style arrangement of The Girl from Ipanema, meaning the beginning of it was a bunch of flutes playing dum da 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 dum dum da da da. Then when it got to the bridge, da 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 da, I wrote all of the strings playing in the stratosphere. So we're talking 50 strings. It was absolutely stunning in the studio. Once again, I was proclaimed genius for the day for writing the best source cue ever heard, ever. And of course, in the movie, uh, John Lovett's getting a massage while this is coming through a speaker. And but it sounded really good on my demo reel. I was very happy to have it. Uh, After that, Mark was calling me for similar things in one movie called Bogus with Gerard Depardieu and Whoopi Goldberg. Uh, Depardieu was playing a Harvey type character, like the play Harvey, where like he's an invisible rabbit that's walking around with Jimmy Stewart, except it's with this little kid. And there was a production number in it uh, of French Persuasion with Whoopi Goldberg and Gerard Depardieu, and it was choreographed by Walter Painter, who I had worked with a bit on shows and acts. And the director of the picture was Norman Jewison. And Mark laid out this big production number with some French tunes and accordion, and I got to do the orchestration. And it was, once again, right up my street. So I was a big hit with Mr. Jewison and with everybody else, and Walter and everybody else in the studio. And of course, Bogus is a picture that you'd have to look it up to see what happened to it. I also worked on pictures like Stuart Saves His Family, which was Stuart Smalley Saves His Family, another great picture, and another picture called Speechless with Michael Keaton. And the picture North I mentioned with the Girl from Ipanema, there were also several cues that took place in different parts of the world, one in Hawaii, and then a Father Knows Best sequence and a Dallas sequence. And I was hired to do all of these kind of sound alike fun things. But this led to Mark asking me to write for the film The American President, which is a beautiful film he did. And Jeff Edmajian orchestrated most of it. Mark wrote a beautiful score. But in the middle of it, Rob Reiner, who was the director, wanted the military band to be playing at a Washington, D.C. event when the president, played by Michael Douglas, meets Annette Bening, who ends up being his love, and to show how they first fall in love. So he wanted the military band to be playing either The Way You Look Tonight by Jerome Kern or uh, I Have Dreamed by Richard Rodgers. So we wrote an arrangement of each of them. They had the military band record it. And Rob decided on I Have Dreamed. And I'd written a very pretty arrangement for like a dance band. And the scene was extremely effective. And they shot it with the Marine Band in Washington, D.C. When they brought it back to Hollywood because of sound effects and whatnot, they decided to replace the Marine Band with a Hollywood orchestra playing the same thing plus added strings. So I got to do it that way. And it's a wonderful sequence in the film. And I'm very grateful that Mark asked me to do that. And he would often give me little cues like that to do. So eventually, Mark was doing a film called South Park and invited me to score a couple of numbers. One of them was a number that Saddam Hussein sang as a, it was drawn, it was animation, and I wrote that song. But then he wanted me to do another song, and he said, "Can you come over to my studio?" His studio was in Laurel Canyon. It was a bit of a trek for me from where I live. I said, "Can't you send it to me online?" He said, "No, no, no. Please come on over." Well, I come on over, and it's an animated stick figure thing, and I hear the song, and my mouth dropped open, and I was laughing myself silly because the name of the song was called Uncle Fucka. That's, as you heard it, Uncle Fucka, Fukka. and it's absolutely vile and ridiculous lyrics. And it was so vile and funny that you just can't help but laugh. And he said, I had to have you come over and see it. I couldn't tell you over the phone. Anyway, he wrote a wonderful little song for it and said to me, make it sound like Mary Poppins Goes to Oklahoma. Once again, right up my alley. And I will tell you that to this day, I get more recognition for having written the orchestration for Uncle Fucker than almost anything else I've done. So I'm grateful to Mark for bringing me in on that. And uh, in fact, I didn't want my kids to hear it because they were all under 10 years old. And then surprisingly, one day I walk in the house and I hear the TV blaring, shut your fucking face, Uncle Fucker. That's what it was. And my kids are sitting there dancing. They had the DVD and they, you know, were telling all their friends I wrote it and I was a big hero for doing that. So that was my movie career. And it continued where I was scoring a little bit on uh, several films. And then my friend Ken Kugler, a very good trombone player as well as a conductor and a composer, was doing music for Mark Isham. And I was asked to orchestrate on a couple of films for him and various TV episodes, which I was conducting and writing for. And I had Irv and Pete Myers and Mort Stevens looking over my shoulder, as well as composer conductor Artie Kane. So it was a very good time for me, and it was very helpful to learn how to do this stuff because the orchestras were much bigger. Typical Hollywood orchestra, it was the size of a symphony, even larger. So we'd be sitting with 50 strings in total, 26, 28 violins in total, and 10 violas or violi, 10 violi, 8 celli, 4 to 6 basses. There'd be 4 to 6 French horns. Usually a symphony orchestra has 4 French horns. We'd have 6 on some movies. There'd be 4 trumpets and 4 trombones. And 12 reeds usually plus saxophone. It was enormous orchestras. And I'd get to hear stuff straight away. I continued to work on a few other films. I also ended up doing a whole bunch of stuff for Doug Besterman on the film Chicago, which was a rather difficult job to work on because they were shooting the film in Toronto and I really couldn't get much information. Just an assignment from Doug and David Crane, the dance arranger. And nobody was communicating with me, so I wouldn't know until it was recorded if it was successful or not. And sometimes something was not quite right, it had to be changed, and I wasn't even present for that. But that's typical of what happens in Hollywood. And occasionally, you just get a call to write a cue and just send it over, and that would happen sometimes too. And one time, Mark called me to do a main title on a picture called The Kid with Bruce Willis. Now, I had nothing to do with this. It just got a last minute call. The other arrangers were, up to their eyes with stuff, and it was an emergency call from Mark. So I said, sure, I'll do it. It was for the next day. And in those days, we were still using fax machines. So the fax machine would kind of start going, you get all these pages, and it wasn't usually the easiest stuff to read. It wasn't necessarily notated very completely. And I got pages and pages and pages, and it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this had to be on the stand, ready to record the next day, which meant the copyists were going to come and collect the music from me probably at 6 o'clock in the morning at the latest. So I had a deadline here of about 12 to 15 hours to write the orchestrations for a symphony-sized orchestra for this main title, music I didn't know. And after writing for 4 or 5 hours, my eyes were just going bonkers and I couldn't see anymore. I was just so tired and just clouding up from all the pages. So I called up Jeff Edmagian, who was the main orchestrator on the film. I said, Jeff, can you help me? He said, no, I'm He said, I'm up to my eyes with stuff too. He said, just close your eyes for a couple of hours. And I did. And I woke up maybe at 4 o'clock in the morning and continued writing this stuff. And it really looked terrible on paper, but I did the best I could. And I had a big orchestra, so I knew it was going to make some noise. And then, of course, after sending it off to the copies at 6 o'clock in the morning, I fell asleep. I got a call that afternoon from Mark saying that it sounded great. Thank you very much for writing it. He said, by the way, your handwriting looked like that of a 4-year-old child. But he said, don't worry, we found a 4-year-old child to copy it for you. So, there's a little bit of humor in that, but I got to do that as well. There were a lot of last minute calls for things like that. I was fortunate to be able to commiserate with Erwin Kostel and Mort and Pete about such things. And Peter taught me a great deal about writing for television because very often, as I mentioned in that earlier cue, there's not much happening. And it's our jobs as composers and then orchestrators to create something where nothing existed, just to create some activity. There'll be long scenes where you see the camera cutting outside from the outside of a house, and the camera moves in and goes into the house, and you see some action happening. And something has to happen during those 20 seconds of camera moving. It was just filler, usually on TV, but that's where the composer comes in handy. And Peter also told me, what do you do when they're showing an actor sitting in a chair and the camera moves in for a close-up? You got to do something if there's nothing happening in the dialogue or sound effects, and it's the music. So you usually write something. I can't even tell you what it is, but you have to write something. On another picture I did, Christmas on the Square with Dolly Parton, the producer, Sam Haskell, had put a temp score on the entire picture. A temp score is where he picks music cues from perhaps other films or other TV shows, and he drops them in over scenes to give an indication to the composer. In this case, it was me and my assistant, Adam Jones. And theoretically, the score was by Dolly Parton, but Dolly wrote her songs. She did not write this underscoring, but it was going to say music by Dolly Parton, whether Adam wrote it or I wrote it or anyone else wrote it. And Sam had put all these other cues in from other pictures, which he was very fond of and perfectly happy to use. However, I suggested that we take these cues he wrote and just replace all the thematic material with Dolly's music. He sort of understood what I was talking about. He did understand, but he just didn't know how it would be done because he had used all of these temporary cues. Well, I took Dolly's tunes and I superimposed them on this, and Adam and I sat down and wrote the music that had to be played underneath it while I was busy orchestrating the songs for the film, the musical. It was a musical, and Debbie Allen directed and choreographed it. One of my favorite moments, though, was talking to Dolly, and I said, Dolly, is there anything I can change? And she says, well, darling, you already changed all my chords. And she laughed. She was very happy with what I did. And we made a very successful film and it won a bunch of awards. And I was very happy to be part of it. So there's a whole different type of writing when you have to work on TV and film. You're accommodating something that is already done, which is the film. And the film is generally cut, and you're adding music to a finished product as opposed to working on a musical where you're all creating together. The music is an afterthought. Another person I met along the way who was extraordinarily helpful to me was David Raxon. David Raxon, mostly known for writing the song Laura, which was for the picture Laura, as well as a wonderful theme from the picture The Bad and the Beautiful. And he also wrote the theme for Ben Casey. I had the pleasure of sharing the podium with David because Michael Feinstein would often sing Laura, and David would conduct, and it would go into his suite from the picture. And what's amazing about his score for the film Laura is that he has this beautiful song that he wrote, and he used it with the strings to show Laura. And then as the picture cut to maybe a restaurant where the villain, played by Clifton Webb, was sitting in a restaurant, the music wouldn't change. It would still be Laura, da 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 da, but it would change from beautiful strings to brass, muted brass saxophones, and it sounded like you're in a restaurant or in a club. And he would do this continually through the picture. It was quite amazing how that would happen. Just changing the orchestral colors would change what was happening on the screen. Brilliant. And David was an excellent conductor. David had actually started as an assistant orchestrator to Robert Russell Bennett and Hans Spialek on Broadway when David was like 21, 22 years old. He managed on the show On Your Toes to somehow insult the composer Richard Rodgers and made a quick exit to Hollywood. And the first job he had in Hollywood was to transcribe Charlie Chaplin playing the violin on a song he wrote into an orchestral piece. The song that Charlie Chaplin wrote on the violin was called Smile. Famous song. Oscar Levant later was quoted as saying, "It's amazing how David was able to take down the melody, the harmony, and the counterpoint simply from Charlie's violin." But David never claimed any more than that he took it down, and it was all Chaplin's idea. Very honorable man. He wrote some beautiful scores, and it's worth studying his music and orchestration. And there are a lot of people like that in Hollywood. Another great ally and composer and orchestrator was Al Sindri. Al Sindri, you may know his name because he orchestrated the Peter Pan with Mary Martin and Cyril Richard in 1954. He didn't do a lot of theater. He was mostly a Hollywood guy and Johnny Green's right-hand man, scoring a lot of the picture Raintree County. And he worked as a regular at MGM, did a lot of stuff on the film of Guys and Dolls along with Nelson Riddle and many, many other pictures. And a very skilled writer. And his start in Hollywood came when he was 17 years old, and he was a tennis pro. And he played tennis with George Gershwin and Arnold Schoenberg, who just happened to be in Los Angeles at that time, 1936, 1937. But Al was a very good writer, ended up doing a lot of writing for Tony Martin, who was very popular as a singer, and I've managed to see many of his orchestrations, Al's. They were very well done. And unfortunately, he's just one of those names that melted into the woodwork, but did much work. Anyway, I thought I'd share some of my Hollywood experiences and TV film stuff. And I hope you'll come back for the next installation of From the Pit.